Grace Mitchell was the most powerful and most feared woman in the city, and she had earned every whisper that followed her name. People said she hated men. People said her heart was made of polished marble, cold, smooth, and utterly impenetrable. They said she had never once given a man the opportunity to step inside her world, never once allowed warmth to crack the surface of that composed, flawless exterior. But then Jack Scott walked through her office door, a quiet, unassuming 38-year-old single father, with no grand ambitions, no dazzling charm, and no agenda beyond raising his 8-year-old daughter Emma and showing up to work on time. He was not rich, he was not polished. He carried no power, no pedigree, no secret weapon beyond a steady heart full of quiet responsibility. And yet, when a dangerous conspiracy began threatening the empire Grace had spent her entire life building, it was this ordinary man. This man no one had bet on, who became the only person she could trust. No one saw it coming. Not the board members, not the gossiping assistants, not the vice president sharpening his knives in the shadows, and certainly not Grace herself. But the heart, it seems, does not consult the mind before it makes its decisions. The 42nd floor of Mitchell Global's headquarters felt like a different atmosphere, entirely thinner, crisper, quieter than the floors below, as if even the air understood that it was operating under different rules up here. The boardroom was all dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass, and on a Tuesday morning in late October, every seat around that enormous table was occupied by men in expensive suits who had spent the weekend rehearsing what they intended to say. They had spreadsheets, they had projections, they had alliances forged over golf courses and private dinners. And then Grace Mitchell walked in, and every carefully prepared argument evaporated before it could fully form. She was 34 years old, and she moved through that room the way a cold front moves through a coastal city, inevitable, precise, and utterly indifferent to the discomfort it causes. Her charcoal blazer was perfectly fitted. Her dark hair was pulled back without a single strand out of place. She set her portfolio on the table without looking at anyone, took her seat at the head, and said, "Let's begin," in a tone that made the word feel like a verdict rather than an invitation. Within 11 minutes, she had identified the flaw in the quarterly projections that 2 senior directors had tried to bury in a footnote. Within 20 minutes, she had named the vendor relationship that was quietly siphoning margin from the Pacific Division. By the time the meeting concluded, one director had tendered a verbal resignation on the spot, and 2 others were seriously reconsidering the side arrangement they had assumed she didn't know about. She knew. Grace Mitchell always knew. That was the thing people never quite adjusted to, not her beauty, not her authority, but her precision, the way her eyes moved across a document and extracted exactly the fact that mattered, the way she asked questions that sounded polite but were, in reality, surgical, the way she never raised her voice, because she never needed to. In the hallways of Mitchell Global, they called her the Ice Queen, not to her face. No one with any self-preservation instinct would have done that, but in the break rooms and the elevator banks and the quiet corners where people whispered things they hoped the building's walls wouldn't carry upward, the Ice Queen, the woman who didn't know how to love, the executive who had turned coldness into a competitive advantage. And the rumor that circulated most persistently through the city's business circles was this: Grace Mitchell hated men. It wasn't an accusation spoken with malice, exactly. It was more like a conclusion people had reached by observing the evidence and filling in the gaps with whatever narrative felt most satisfying. She had never been photographed at a charity gala with a date. She had never been spotted at a restaurant in the kind of intimate conversation that columnists like to speculate about. She had dismissed 3 male assistants in her first year as CEO, terminated 2 male directors for underperformance without visible sympathy, and publicly rejected a merger offer from a male-led firm, in terms so pointed that the acquiring CEO had apparently needed 3 days to recover his professional composure. What the gossips did not know, what Grace had never told anyone, was that the coldness had a history. It had a specific shape, carved out by specific wounds. There had been a man named Richard, once, and Grace had believed in him the way young people believe in things before life teaches them better. She had been 26, and Richard had been charming and attentive and full of promises, and she had given him access to a business concept she had spent 2 years developing, and he had taken it and signed it under his own name with a partner she had never met. And by the time she understood what had happened, the damage was irreversible. There had been a mentor. After that, a senior executive named Gerald, who had offered guidance and positioned himself as a professional ally, and who had spent 18 months taking partial credit for her work in meetings she had not been invited to attend. There had been smaller betrayals after those, sharper in some ways because she should have known better by then. And each one had added another layer to the structure she was building around herself, not out of bitterness, she told herself, but out of clarity. She had simply learned the lesson. She did not need anyone. She needed competence, results, and distance. And for several years, this system had worked admirably well, until the morning her assistant, a capable and somewhat terrified young man named Kevin, appeared in her doorway with the expression of someone diffusing a device he did not fully understand, and informed her that he was resigning, effective at the end of the week, because he had received a position in Portland that he could not in good conscience decline. Grace had studied him for 3 full seconds, and then said, "Fine. Send HR the paperwork." She returned her attention to her screen. Inside, something that was not quite panic but was adjacent to it had begun its quiet calculations. She would need a new secretary. And that was a problem she had very little patience for solving. Jack Scott woke at 5:45 every morning. Not because an alarm told him to, but because his body had learned that 5:45 was when the day needed to begin if everything was going to unfold in the right order. Coffee, first 2 cups, black, standing at the kitchen counter, while the gray light of early morning came through the window above the sink. Then Emma's breakfast, which varied according to whatever Emma had declared her preference to be that week. Currently it was scrambled eggs with toast cut diagonally, because Emma had decided that triangles tasted better than rectangles, and Jack had not found a compelling reason to argue the point. He would wake her at 6:30, and she would make the small sounds of protest that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing. And by 7 they would be in the car, Emma with her backpack and her opinions about the radio station, and Jack with his coffee thermos and the quiet gratitude he carried for this ordinary morning, this ordinary life, this small person beside him who needed him to be steady and present and there. He had not always been a secretary. Before Emma was born, before Laura had gotten sick, Jack had operated at a different altitude professionally. He had managed crisis communications for a mid-sized consulting firm, advising executives through regulatory investigations and public relations, disasters with the kind of calm competence that had made partners take notice. He had been, by most measures, a person on an upward trajectory. Then Laura's diagnosis had arrived. And the trajectory had bent itself around something more important. The last 2 years of Laura's life had required a reorganization of priorities so complete that when she was gone, when Emma was 5, and the apartment was suddenly very quiet, and Jack was standing in the kitchen at 5:45 with only one person's breakfast to make the close question of returning to his former professional intensity, had felt almost beside the point. What Emma needed was him. Present, consistent, there. A high-demand executive role would not accommodate school pickup at 3:15 or pediatric appointments, or the kind of emotional availability that a 5-year-old who had just lost her mother required. So Jack had made a decision, and he had made peace with it, and he had applied for the position of executive secretary at Mitchell Global, with full knowledge that he was, by almost any conventional measure, dramatically overqualified. He had not mentioned this in his cover letter. He saw no reason to. The interview was on a Thursday afternoon, and Jack arrived 3 minutes early, which was a habit he had never been able to shake. The waiting room outside Grace Mitchell's office held 4 other candidates, all male, all polished. All doing the thing that men in waiting rooms before important interviews tend to do, which is sit at careful angles and project an impression of relaxed confidence they do not entirely feel. Jack sat down, checked his phone for a message from Emma's after-school program, confirmed that everything was fine, and then put his phone away and waited. When his turn came, he walked into the office, shook hands, sat down, and answered every question Grace Mitchell asked him with the precise amount of information the question required, not more, not less. He did not try to impress her. He did not perform enthusiasm. When she asked why he wanted the position, he said, "The hours work for my schedule, the role suits my current skills, and I believe I can do it well." Grace had looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to interpret. And then she had looked back at his resume. And something in the lines around her eyes had shifted almost imperceptibly. His qualifications were, frankly, exceptional. Not secretary-level exceptional. Distractingly exceptional. She had set the folder down. "We'll be in touch," she said. And Jack had nodded and thanked her and left, and Grace had sat alone in her office for a moment, looking at the doorway through which he had just passed, feeling something she could not immediately categorize. 2 days later, Kevin had called him with the offer. The department pool, which had organized itself around an informal betting operation, placed the over-under on Jack's employment at 3 weeks. 4 weeks, maximum, said one of the analysts. "She'll find a reason," said another. "She always finds a reason." The first 2 weeks did not produce a reason. This was, in itself, unusual enough to generate commentary. Jack arrived each morning at 8:50, his desk organized in a way that suggested a mind that processed information spatially rather than alphabetically. And he began working. He handled Grace's schedule with a precision that other assistants had only approximated. He anticipated conflicts before they became problems. He drafted correspondence in language that was direct without being curt, a balance that Kevin had never quite managed, and he filtered the constant incoming requests with a judgment that Grace found herself relying on almost immediately, which was an experience she found mildly disorienting. He did not compliment her. He did not seek her approval. He did not linger after completing a task to see whether she had noticed. He did not, as far as she could observe, behave in any of the ways that male assistants she had employed previously had behaved, the careful deference that always felt like calculation, the flattery that was always angled towards some advantage, the expressions of admiration that were trying to accomplish something other than admiration. Jack simply worked, and at 5:15, without fail, he shut his computer down, organized whatever he was leaving for the following morning, and left to pick up Emma. Grace had noticed this the first week and had said nothing. She noticed a great deal about Jack Scott in those early weeks and said nothing about any of it. She noticed that he helped the new marketing coordinator navigate the printer situation without being asked, and without making the coordinator feel foolish about needing help. She noticed that he held the elevator for the facility staff without the slight performance of generosity that people sometimes added to such gestures. She noticed that he brought lunch from home in a container that Emma had apparently decorated with stickers at some point, and that he ate it at his desk without any self-consciousness about the stickers. And she noticed the phone call. It was a Thursday evening, nearly 7 o'clock, and Grace was still at her desk reviewing a contract that required her full attention, which meant the floor around her was mostly empty. She had gone to the kitchen for water and was passing back through the open plan area when she saw that Jack was still at his desk. She had assumed he had left hours ago, and that he was speaking quietly into his phone, with his head bent slightly forward and one hand resting on his knee. She slowed, without intending to. "Did you eat your vegetables?" he was saying. A pause. "Both of them? Or just the ones you like?" Another pause, and then a sound that Grace realized, with some surprise, was Jack laughing, not the controlled, workplace-appropriate laughter she had occasionally heard from him, but something softer and more unguarded, something that seemed to come from a part of him that the office did not normally see. Okay, tell me about the dragon." He listened for a long time then, nodding occasionally, and his face had an expression on it that Grace could not fully see from where she stood, but that she recognized, in some wordless part of herself, as the expression of a person who is exactly where they want to be. She stood there longer than she meant to. She walked back to her office slowly. She sat down at her desk and looked at the contract, and did not, for several minutes, read a single word of it. She was thinking about the expression on his face. She was thinking about what it meant to have somewhere you wanted to be. Someone waiting for you. Someone who needed you to come home. Someone for whom the day did not properly end until you arrived. She had not had that. She had not had anything like that in a very long time. And she had told herself that she did not want it. And she was not certain, sitting at her desk at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, that this was entirely true. When she finally looked up, Jack's desk was empty. He had finished his call and gone home to Emma, without knowing that his CEO had stood in the hallway watching him, and had felt, for the first time in years, something other than the clean, manageable emotion of professional satisfaction. Grace Mitchell set her pen down very carefully, and without fully understanding why, she smiled at the empty desk. The change in her attention was gradual enough that she might have been able to explain it away, to herself if not to others, as professional observation rather than personal interest. She was simply noting things, she told herself. She was simply aware of her environment. But the things she noted were becoming increasingly specific to Jack, and the awareness was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as professional. She noticed him helping the security guard at the main entrance, an older man named Walter, carry boxes up from the loading dock one afternoon, after what must have been an early delivery. She noticed because she happened to be returning from a meeting and saw them through the lobby glass, Jack with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, saying something that made Walter laugh. She noticed that Jack never mentioned this to anyone. She noticed, several days later, that Jack had quietly organized the break room supply situation that had been a low-grade source of irritation for the administrative staff for weeks. Without sending a memo about it or positioning it as an initiative, he had simply fixed it. She noticed these things the way you notice a pattern once you have started looking for it, compounding, accumulating, building into something that was harder and harder to dismiss. And then came the Monday morning, when the answer became impossible to avoid. She had reviewed the weekend security footage, a routine check she performed periodically, specifically on the building access logs, and in doing so, had pulled up Saturday's lobby camera record, looking for something unrelated. What she found instead was Jack, at 9:15 in the morning on a weekend, bringing Walter to the lobby elevator. And then, when Walter collapsed suddenly with his hand pressed to his chest, staying with him, calling emergency services, and riding with the ambulance to the hospital. The timestamp showed him arriving back at his car at 2 in the afternoon. He had not mentioned it, not on Monday morning, not at all. Grace had sat with this information for the rest of the morning, before she walked out to his desk at 11:45 and waited until he looked up from his screen. Walter was in the hospital this weekend, she said. It was not precisely a question. Jack's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Yes, he said. Are you going to tell me why you didn't report it? He seemed to consider this genuinely. He was embarrassed, Jack said. He didn't want to make a thing of it. He's doing fine, they're adjusting his medication. I didn't think it needed to become an incident report. Grace studied him. You spent 5 hours at the hospital with an employee you barely know, on your day off, and told no one. He didn't want to be alone, Jack said simply. Grace stood there for another moment. The answer was so uncomplicated that it almost didn't fit. There was no calculus in it, no positioning, no ledger of favors owed and favors collected. He had stayed because a man needed someone to stay. That's the reason, she said. That's the reason, he said. She walked back to her office. She sat down. She thought about the answer for the rest of the day and into the night, and the thing that kept returning to her was not the action itself, but the way he had described it, as if it required no explanation. As if, of course, you stayed, as if the idea of leaving had not occurred to him as a serious option. She began, cautiously, and without quite admitting it to herself, to look forward to the mornings. The company family event was an annual concession to the notion that Mitchell Global was, in some meaningful sense, a community rather than simply a business. Grace found the event tedious, in the way she found most things tedious that required her to perform social warmth rather than simply experience it. She attended each year because her leadership presence was necessary, and because there were always informal conversations that yielded useful professional intelligence. She did not, typically, enjoy herself. This year, she was standing near the catering table with a glass of mineral water when she became aware of a small person standing very close to her left side and looking up at her with an expression of frank, uncomplicated curiosity that adults rarely directed at Grace Mitchell without also directing fear or calculation at her. The small person was Emma Scott. She was 8 years old, and she had her father's directness and her own particular brand of self-possession that seemed to require no effort. Her hair was in 2 slightly imperfect braids that Grace recognized immediately as the work of a father who had learned to do hair because it needed to be done, not because he was naturally gifted at it. "Are you the boss of my dad?" Emma said. Grace looked down at her. "I'm the CEO of the company," she said. "So yes." Emma appeared to process this. "Is he a good worker?" Grace considered the question seriously, which felt like the right thing to do. "He's one of the better ones," she said. Emma nodded, satisfied. "He works really hard," Emma said. "He doesn't complain about it, but I know because he's tired sometimes. But he always reads to me before I go to sleep, even when he's tired." Grace said nothing. "Thank you for not firing him," Emma added. Grace opened her mouth, and what came out was a laugh, a real one, brief and genuine, from a part of herself she had not recently exercised. "You're welcome," she managed. Emma smiled at her with the particular confidence of someone who considers the matter settled and moved on to the dessert table, and Grace stood where she was and let the laughter settle back into something quieter and stranger and harder to name. She found herself, over the next hour, watching Emma navigate the event, asking one of the engineers a very specific question about the building's ventilation system, organizing a small group of other children into what appeared to be an invented game, consoling a younger child who had spilled juice on her dress with a seriousness and gentleness that seemed entirely unperformed. At some point in the afternoon, Emma appeared at her side again and took her hand, simply took it, without asking, the way children claim rights of contact that adults have long since learned to negotiate, and led her to the corner where she had been drawing, and showed her a picture she had made of the 3 of them: Jack, Emma, Grace. And she looked up at Grace with those frank, serious eyes and said, "You kind of look like the mom I always wished I had." Grace stood, very still. The room continued around her conversation and music and the ordinary sounds of a late afternoon. Inside her chest, something that had been locked and still for a very long time shifted on its foundation. And she felt it move. And she did not know what to do with the feeling, except to stand there and let it happen. She squeezed Emma's hand. She could not find any words. She did not need to. Daniel Reeves had been vice president of operations at Mitchell Global for 6 years. And in those 6 years, he had developed a specific and increasingly urgent relationship with the idea that the company should be led by him. He was 61 years old, and he had spent his career accumulating the kind of professional credentials that he believed entitled him to more authority than he currently held. And the fact that the board had passed over him twice in favor of a woman 27 years, his junior, had calcified into something that he had stopped calling resentment and started calling a corrective vision. He was not, by his own assessment, doing anything wrong. He was simply identifying an error in the organization's leadership structure and taking steps to address it. The plan had required 8 months of careful construction. It involved a set of financial transactions routed through 3 subsidiary accounts that had been designed to suggest that Grace Mitchell had been diverting company funds into a private holding structure. It involved 3 documents that looked, at a careful glance, like internal memos authorizing these transfers under her electronic signature. It involved a relationship with a financial journalist who had agreed, in exchange for certain considerations, to publish a story at a moment of maximum impact. And it involved the patience to wait until the quarterly board review the moment when any finding of financial misconduct would carry the maximum possible institutional weight. Daniel had been patient. He had waited, and now, as November settled over the city, he could feel the plan approaching its conclusion with the satisfying inevitability of something he had built himself. The first signal reached Grace on a Monday morning, a call from the chief financial officer flagging anomalies in the subsidiary account records. By Tuesday, the story had appeared in a financial publication, not the front page, but prominent enough. By Wednesday, 3 institutional shareholders had requested emergency communications with the board. By Thursday, the company's stock had declined by 11% over 4 days, and Grace Mitchell was sitting in her office at midnight, staring at documents she had never seen before that bore her name and her digital signature, and for the first time in her professional life she did not immediately know what to do. Every public relations professional she trusted was managing their own relationships with the story. Every lawyer she called had subtle conflicts. The board members she reached were careful and non-committal, and she could hear in their voices the particular quality of political calculation that people employ when they are deciding which side of a situation is going to be more advantageous. She was, for the first time in 10 years, alone with a problem she could not solve by being the smartest person in the room. And then there was a knock at her office door at 12:15 in the morning, and Jack Scott walked in with his laptop bag and 2 coffees from the 24-hour place 3 blocks away. He had not been asked. He had seen the news alert on his phone at 9 in the evening, after Emma was asleep, and he had understood immediately what the story represented and what it was likely actually to mean, and he had made a decision about where he needed to be. He set one of the coffees in front of her and sat down across from her desk and opened his laptop and said, "Walk me through what you know." Grace looked at him for a moment. "It's midnight," she said. "I know," he said. "Walk me through it." Something in the steadiness of him, the complete absence of alarm or performance or agenda, made her begin talking. She talked for 40 minutes. He listened, asked specific questions, made notes. At one point he asked for access to the subsidiary account logs, and she gave it to him. And he was quiet for 20 minutes while he worked through them, and the quality of his silence was not the silence of someone lost, but the silence of someone reading a map. She watched him without speaking. She was trying to understand who this person was. Not Jack Scott, the secretary, but the person who was currently examining financial architecture with the focused precision of someone who had done exactly this kind of thing before. "You did crisis management before this," she said. It was not quite a question. He glanced up. "Among other things," he said. "Why didn't you tell you?" He returned to his screen. "It didn't seem relevant to the position I applied for." Over the following 72 hours, Jack did not leave the building for more than a few hours at a time. Emma had been collected by a neighbor he trusted, a retired teacher named Margaret, who had helped before, and whose steadiness he relied on in moments that required his full attention to be somewhere else. He worked through the subsidiary account records with a methodical patience that Grace found both impressive and slightly unnerving, reconstructing the transaction pathway with the kind of forensic attention that could only come from someone who had previously spent time understanding exactly how such things were hidden. He found the seam on the second night, a timestamp inconsistency in the third document that revealed it had been created 11 days after the date it purported to bear, combined with a metadata trail that led, through 3 degrees of indirection, to an internal user credential that had not been Grace's. He found the email chain 12 messages between Daniel and the financial journalist, preserved in a backup server that Daniel had apparently forgotten existed or had assumed was beyond reach. He found the subsidiary account statements that showed the actual origin of the diverted funds, which were not Grace's accounts, but rather a structure that had been quietly built over 4 years, using company resources, in a way that Daniel had evidently found sustainable, until this particular pressure was applied to it. Grace sat beside him at 2 in the morning of the third night, while he assembled the final sequence of documentation. And she said nothing because there was nothing to say that would add to what was happening. At some point she looked at him, really looked at him, the way you look at something when you stop performing and simply see, and she said, "Why are you doing this?" He kept his eyes on the screen for a moment before he answered. "Because what's happening to you is wrong," he said, "and because you don't deserve to have everything you've built taken away by someone who was simply willing to do something you weren't." She looked at him for a long time. "I don't understand you," she said. He glanced at her then, and the expression on his face was something between quiet and warm and entirely unguarded. "I know," he said, and she felt, somewhere behind her sternum, a sensation she had not experienced in so long that it took her several seconds to identify it as the particular quality of being seen. Her eyes were wet. She did not look away. For the first time in more years than she could easily count, Grace Mitchell cried in front of another person, and the other person did not try to fix it or manage it or use it. He simply stayed. They were still in the office at 3 in the morning when she told him about Richard. She was not sure exactly how it began, whether she had simply run out of the energy required to maintain the walls, or whether something about the way he had listened to her all night had opened a channel that could not now be closed. She told him about the business concept she had developed at 26 and what Richard had done with it. She told him about Gerald, who had been her mentor and her betrayer simultaneously, and about the particular damage that does to a person the way it teaches you, not simply to distrust the person, but to distrust your own capacity to read people. She told him about the smaller betrayals, the ones that came later when she should have been more guarded, and about the specific decision she had made after the last of them, that the safest architecture was one with no interior. No one got close enough to find the things worth taking. She had built her life around this decision, and it had worked. She had become formidable. She had become powerful. She had become, by every external measure, successful beyond what anyone in her early life would have predicted. And she was, at 34, profoundly alone. Jack listened to all of it the way he listened to most things, without interruption, without the kind of sympathetic expressions that are really about the listener's own discomfort, without the impulse to immediately offer a framework for her feelings. He simply received it, and when she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I can't tell you that the people who hurt you weren't who you thought they were. They were. You read them right, and they still chose to do what they did. That's the part that's hardest to come back from, when you learn that being right about someone's potential doesn't protect you from what they decide to do with it." Grace looked at him. "I don't know how to trust anymore," she said. "Not really. I've forgotten the mechanism." He looked back at her steadily. "You don't have to rebuild everything at once," he said. "You don't have to decide to trust the whole world. You just have to start with one person. One moment. Let it be small. See what happens." She sat with this for a while. The building was very quiet around them. The city outside the windows was doing what cities do at 3 in the morning, reducing to its essential movements, its necessary functions, the people and vehicles that cannot wait for daylight. "Emma's lucky to have you," she said finally. Something in his expression shifted, warmer, more interior. "I'm the lucky one," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. She did it before she had decided to, before the part of her that would have stopped it could intervene. And his hand was warm and still under hers, and he did not move, and he did not speak. They sat like that for a long moment in the quiet office at 3 in the morning, and Grace Mitchell let herself, for the first time in a very long time, simply be somewhere without building an exit. The shareholder meeting was on a Friday morning in December, and the room held 41 people, including 7 board members, 14 institutional shareholder representatives, legal counsel on 3 sides, and Daniel Reeves, who had arrived with his own attorney, and the particular composure of a man who believed his position was secured. Grace arrived last, which she had timed deliberately. She sat at her position at the table, without looking at Daniel, and opened the meeting with the straightforward acknowledgement that serious allegations had been made, and that the board was owed a complete and documented response. Then she nodded to the screen at the end of the room, and Jack began. He stood at the presentation station with the steady and unhurried manner that Grace had come to understand was simply how he operated when the situation required it, not performed confidence, not managed calm, but the actual thing. He walked the room through the account records first, laying out the transaction sequence in a way that was clear enough for the non-financial shareholders and precise enough for the auditors. He showed the document metadata, the timestamp inconsistencies, the credential trail, the backup server records. He presented the email chain between Daniel and the financial journalist in its complete form, which produced a silence in the room that had a specific texture, the silence of people revising their understanding of a situation in real time. Daniel's attorney leaned close to him and said something quiet. Daniel's face had acquired the particular quality of stillness that attaches to people when they realize that the plan they were certain of has encountered something it did not account for. The something, in this case, was Jack Scott. By the time Jack had finished presenting the subsidiary account structure, the 4-year history of it, the patterns, the origin points that led back to Daniel, with a clarity that left essentially no interpretive room. 3 board members had requested an immediate audit, and 1 had already placed a call to the general counsel's office. Daniel's attorney requested a recess. The board chair declined. The vote to engage external forensic auditors was unanimous. Daniel Reeves was escorted from the building by company security before noon. By 2 in the afternoon, the financial journalist had published a correction and a statement that was, in its careful corporate language, a complete retraction of the original story. The stock had already begun its recovery by the time Grace was standing in the hallway outside the meeting room, watching the last of the board members make their way to the elevators. The adrenaline of the morning had not yet fully metabolized, and she was still in the state that follows high-stakes hours slightly outside of time, perceiving everything with an unusual clarity. Jack was standing a few feet away, putting materials back into his bag with the same methodical care he brought to everything, and she watched him for a moment before she crossed to where he stood. He looked up. "You should eat something," he said. "You haven't today." She almost laughed. "That's your response to all of that?" "You also haven't slept properly in 4 days," he said. "I'm aware," she said. She stood in front of him and let the moment settle around them. The hallway was emptying. The building's ordinary rhythms were reasserting themselves, phones and printers and distant conversation. She looked at him for a long moment and then said the things she had been carrying since 3 in the morning 3 nights ago. "I used to think being enough for myself was strength," she said. "I spent 10 years perfecting it. The distance, the walls, the whole architecture." She paused. "I thought I was being careful. I think now maybe I was just being afraid. And calling it something more dignified." Jack waited. He was very good at waiting. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said. She looked at him. "I'm not sure what to do with that." He looked back at her with the expression she had first noticed in the hallway on that Thursday evening present. Unguarded, warm in a way that was not performing anything. "I think you're already doing it," he said quietly. He had not yet said what she wanted him to say. And she knew it would not come today, and she found that she could hold that she could stand in a hallway with something unresolved and not need to resolve it immediately. She was already learning, she supposed, to let things be small and real and slow. The months that followed were not dramatic in the ways that the preceding weeks had been. They were, instead, full of smaller things, the kind of things that accumulate into a life without announcing themselves. Grace began arriving slightly earlier on the mornings, when she knew Jack would have needed to rearrange his schedule for Emma's school events, so that his desk was already organized, and he could leave without disruption at the end of the day. She did not tell him she was doing this. She did not need to. She began learning the names of the people on the cleaning crew, and then the names of their children, and then the particular logistical complications of their schedules, information she had previously regarded as beyond the scope of her professional attention, and that she now found she was genuinely interested in. The office did not immediately know what to make of this. The betting pool had been suspended, somewhat awkwardly, in the aftermath of the shareholder meeting, which had produced more collective embarrassment than most people were comfortable articulating. The woman who had been called the Ice Queen was not, it became apparent over the following weeks, actually what the name had suggested. She was, instead, a person who had been hurt in specific ways and had responded to being hurt in the way that intelligent, self-sufficient people often do by building systems. The systems had worked, insofar as they had protected her from additional damage. They had also cost her things she had not fully accounted for. She was, gradually, doing the accounting. Emma continued to have opinions about Grace, which she shared with her father, with the directness that Grace had recognized from their first meeting as an inherited quality. She told Jack that his boss had nice hair, and that she seemed like someone who needed someone to show her where things were, which Emma was prepared to do. She told him that she thought Grace was lonely, which was a word that 8-year-olds use with more precision than adults typically give them credit for. She told him, on a Saturday morning in January when they were making pancakes, and Grace was presumably somewhere across the city doing whatever bosses did on weekends, that she hoped his boss would come to her school play in February. "She hasn't been invited," Jack said. "You could invite her," Emma said. Jack flipped a pancake and did not immediately respond. "I could," he agreed. He invited her on a Tuesday. Grace attended on a Friday evening in a conference center that smelled of industrial cleaning products and optimism, and she sat between Jack and an empty folding chair and watched Emma play the role of a talking oak tree in a surprisingly well-mounted production of a story about a forest that learns to share its resources. Emma delivered her 3 lines with the particular seriousness of someone who has thought carefully about the interior life of a tree, and Grace laughed more than once and applauded with a genuine enthusiasm that surprised the people sitting nearby. After the performance, walking back to their cars in the cold February air, Emma took both of their hands, Grace's right hand and Jack's left, and walked between them, and the 3 of them moved through the parking lot like that, in the quiet and the cold and the perfectly ordinary evening, and it felt to Grace like something she had not known she was allowed to have. The conversation about what they were to each other, what this was, what it might become, happened on a Sunday in March, over coffee in the kitchen of Jack's apartment, while Emma was at a birthday party that would occupy her for another 2 hours. It was not an elaborate conversation. Neither of them was a person who required elaborate language for things that were actually simple. Jack said that he had not expected to meet someone who made him want to reorganize his understanding of what was possible. And Grace said that she had not expected that she still had the capacity to be reorganized, and then they sat with that for a while, and the coffee got cold, and outside the kitchen window the city was doing its ordinary Saturday things. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture she had made at 3 in the morning in the office, returned now in the daylight, in the ordinary morning, with nothing dramatic around it, which was somehow more significant than anything dramatic would have been. "I'd like to try this," he said. She looked at him. "So would I," she said. The birthday party was for a classmate of Emma's named Sophia, and it ran 40 minutes longer than scheduled, and Emma returned in a state of well-fed happiness that declined gracefully into sleep approximately 12 minutes after she arrived home. Jack carried her to her room and came back to find Grace still at the kitchen table with the 2 cold coffees and a look on her face that he had not seen before, not the professional composure, and not the vulnerability of 3-inch gloat in the morning, and not the careful tentative warmth of recent halogen months, but something quieter and more settled, like a person who has arrived somewhere after a long journey and is still deciding what to make of the destination. He made fresh coffee. They talked until the light outside the window changed from afternoon to evening to the particular blue of a city night. Grace did not go home until after 9, and she drove through the quiet streets with the window down slightly, despite the cold, and she was not thinking about the company or the board or the auditors or the work that would be waiting for her on Monday. She was thinking about a kitchen table and 2 coffees, and a man who had stayed at her office at midnight because he had decided that the right thing to do was be there. She was thinking about Emma's hand in hers in the cold parking lot. She was thinking about the peculiar, unexpected architecture of the thing that was being built slowly, without blueprints, by people who had both been careful for different reasons and were now choosing, carefully, to be less careful. 3 months later, Grace Mitchell attended Emma's end-of-year school celebration and sat in the auditorium with the other parents in the folding chairs that were designed for people significantly smaller than most adults, and she clapped when Emma's class was called, and she cheered, actually cheered, which was not something she had previously understood herself to be capable of in a school auditorium when Emma received a certificate for creative writing, which she had apparently been composing with dedication and ambition all year. Emma ran to them after and handed Grace a rolled piece of paper tied with a yellow ribbon. Inside was a drawing. It was, in Emma's particular idiom, confident lines, deliberate coloring, the spatial logic of a child who thinks about what things look like from the inside, a picture of 3 people at a kitchen table. There was a man with dark hair and a kind face, recognizable as Jack by the thermos Emma had given him for his birthday, and that had subsequently become as much a part of his identity as his steady hands. There was a small person in the middle who was unmistakably Emma, because Emma had drawn herself with the two slightly imperfect braids and an expression of absolute contentment. And there was a woman with her hair down, not pulled back, not composed, simply down, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and a look on her face that Emma had captured with a child's uncompromising honesty as the look of someone who has come home. Underneath the three figures, in the large, careful letters of someone who has recently mastered the skill and intends to use it: Our family. Grace looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she looked up at Emma, who was watching her with the frank, expectant expression of someone who has given a gift and is waiting to see if the recipient understands what it means. Then she looked at Jack, who was looking at her with the steady, warm, unguarded expression she had first noticed on a Thursday evening when she had stood in a hallway and watched him on the phone, and had felt, without knowing what to call it, that this was a person who knew how to be exactly where he needed to be. Her eyes were wet. She did not try to prevent it. She pulled Emma into a hug that surprised Emma slightly, and then did not surprise her at all, because Emma was 8 years old and had been working toward this outcome with the patience and certainty of someone who understood, in her own terms, exactly what was needed. Jack put his arm around them both. They stood in the school auditorium, in the middle of the ordinary noise of an ordinary celebration, and it was not glamorous, and it was not composed, and it was not what the Ice Queen of Mitchell Global was supposed to look like. And Grace Mitchell did not care even slightly. A year after that, the people who still occasionally used the phrase Ice Queen to describe the CEO of Mitchell Global did so with a slight confusion, because the description no longer matched what they observed. They saw instead a woman who arrived at her executive floor with a photograph on her desk, 3 people at a kitchen table, rendered in crayon, and who had been known to leave the office at 5:15 on certain evenings for reasons that her assistant had stopped needing to explain. They saw a woman who had become, by some accounts, more effective professionally rather than less, because something in her had relaxed from the permanent readiness of someone who expects attack into the quieter attention of someone who is simply paying close attention to the work. What the whispers had never understood, and what Grace had eventually come to understand, was that the coldness had never been her nature. It had been her response to having been hurt, and it had served its purpose, and then it had outlived its purpose, and she had finally been willing to let it go, not because she had stopped being careful, but because she had found something worth being careful about. The city had known Grace Mitchell as the Ice Queen, the woman who hated men, the executive who had turned isolation into an art form. But the woman who drove home on a Tuesday evening with Emma's drawing on the passenger seat and Jack's thermos in the cup holder, and a company she had saved, and a small family that had found her when she was not looking for it, that woman was simply happy. And happiness, it turned out, required no particular architecture. It only required the willingness to begin with one person, one moment, something small. See what happens. The people who had watched Grace Mitchell from a distance had concluded that she was made of something other than ordinary human feeling, cooler, harder, less permeable to the things that moved other people. They had been wrong. She was made of the same things everyone is made of. She had simply needed the right person to remind her. And the right person, it turned out, had shown up with 2 coffees at midnight and a daughter with imperfect braids, and the particular kind of love that does not announce itself, but simply stays through the hard nights and the board meetings and the ordinary mornings, steady and present and entirely without condition. Sometimes the person who heals the most broken heart is not the most perfect person in the room. Sometimes it is simply the one who knows, without being told, that you stay.